There are moments in history so extraordinary that we struggle to believe they ever happened because they seem to defy the natural order of the world. The story of Zenobia is one of those moments. Imagine this: not a mighty Roman emperor, not a battle-hardened general, but a queen from a desert city who dared to look Rome in the eye and declare, "I will not bow to you." She didn't stop at words. Zenobia marched her armies into Egypt, tore lands from the grip of what was once thought an invincible empire, and forced even Emperor Aurelian, hailed as the restorer of the world, to tremble at her audacity. But history is never that simple. When we look at Zenobia, we are faced with a question that refuses an easy answer. Was she a symbol of freedom, a woman who rose to deliver Palmyra from the shadow of foreign empires? Or was she simply another ambitious ruler, a new Cleopatra, seeking to carve out her own dominion only to be crushed beneath the grinding wheel of history? Rome wrote her tale as that of a rebel subdued, while the East remembered her as an immortal queen. Between these two extremes, where does the truth lie? And will we ever reach it? Or will Zenobia forever remain a ghostly figure in the desert, glorious and tragic, real and yet fading into whispers carried by the sands? To understand Zenobia, we first need to picture the city that gave birth to her, the city that shaped her spirit, a place so unusual that the Greeks called it the City of Palms, while the Romans saw it as a jewel shimmering in the desert where sand and civilization collided to create something that felt like a mirage turned real. Palmyra was never just another city. It was a vision made solid, rising out of the endless Syrian sands, where merchants, mercenaries, philosophers, priests, and wanderers from across the world converged. Palmyra sat right on the Silk Road, and that road carried more than silk from China pearls, from India and spices, from Arabia. It carried dreams. After days of trudging through burning sands, weary caravans would catch sight of its gates, and Palmyra would appear like salvation itself. This was no tiny oasis with a few huts. It was a dazzling city of marble columns, reaching into the sky of grand temples, devoted to foreign gods of wide forums, where merchants from east and west haggled, bargained, and sometimes shouted at each other in every language under the sun. In Palmyra, you could hear Greek rolling from the lips of orators, Latin in the voices of Roman officials, Aramaic among the locals, Persian spoken by traders from Ctesiphon, and the guttural rhythm of Arabic from the nomadic tribes. The city was a symphony of languages, faiths, and customs, a place where the Semitic god Bel was worshipped alongside the Greek Zeus, and where funerary busts still show us faces of merchants wearing Greek-style cloaks while keeping their Eastern beards and hair. Palmyra was not an empire, but it was a world unto itself, a miniature cosmos caught between two giants. To the west loomed Rome, massive, disciplined, insatiable, looking at the desert as just another frontier to police. To the east lay the Sassanid Persians, ancient powerful, with their armored cavalry and their cities strung along the Tigris. Palmyra could not match either in military might, but it possessed other weapons: money, goods, and location. It was like a small bird trapped between two enormous eagles, and yet through cunning, it survived. More than that, it thrived. Along its marble-paved avenues, endless camel caravans paraded past bearing chests filled with incense, ivory, and gems. Wealth poured into the city, and with it rose temple after temple, colonnades so high they seemed to defy the desert itself, a declaration that Palmyra was no mere stopover but a center of civilization. Its people dressed in silk adorned themselves with gold, and even in death they carved inscriptions in multiple languages upon their tombs, eager to be remembered not just as merchants, but as citizens of the world. But wealth is a flame, and flames draw storms. Palmyra's riches made it irresistible to both Rome and Persia. To control Palmyra was to control the richest trade route of the age. Rome tried to install its own officials. Persia tested its power with troops at the border and caught between them. Palmyra learned the art of survival, coaxing, resisting, flattering, and quietly defending its own independence. And it was in this world, this city where splendor stood on fragile foundations, where stone columns rose out of sand, where the desert and civilization were woven tightly together, that Zenobia emerged. She was not Rome's creation, nor purely of the East. She was the embodiment of Palmyra itself, a living fusion, a fragment of a culture that could not be defined by a single name. Before Zenobia ever spoke, her city had already spoken for her, whispering through the desert winds that at the edge of empires, an independent power could exist, waiting only for a hand bold enough to seize it. And as we shall see, that hand did indeed appear. Zenobia is one of those rare figures in history whose very origins are shrouded in a haze of legend. Unlike Roman emperors with carefully recorded genealogies or Eastern kings with dynasties stretching back centuries, Zenobia emerged from the borderlands of the known world, where history and myth blur so deeply it's nearly impossible to separate one from the other. To the Romans, she was a threat, so their accounts are tinged with both admiration and scorn. To the Syrians and Arabs, she was a source of pride, her image embroidered with brilliant, sometimes unverifiable details. That tension makes tracing her roots a difficult task, yet it also opens up a world where history feels like the desert surrounding Palmyra, every gust of wind blowing away a layer of sand to reveal a different truth beneath. One of the most famous claims about Zenobia is that she was descended from Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Ptolemaic Egypt. If true, it would mean Zenobia carried the blood of one of antiquity's most powerful and notorious dynasties, a lineage that fused Macedonian Greek with Egyptian tradition. Roman sources, such as the Historia Augusta, hinted at this connection perhaps not only to cast Zenobia as a new Cleopatra, but also to stir Rome's lingering obsession with the woman who once enthralled Caesar and Antony. Yet most modern historians view this as exaggeration or even propaganda, since there is no concrete evidence tying Zenobia's family to the Ptolemies. More likely, claiming descent from Cleopatra was a political move, a way for Zenobia to wrap herself in the glory of the past, and convince both her people and her enemies that she had the legitimacy to defy Rome. Another theory suggests Zenobia belonged to a noble family native to Palmyra of Aramaic or Arab stock, who had gradually absorbed Roman and Greek culture through trade and contact. Some accounts even describe her as having Macedonian ancestry, a supposed descendant of Alexander the Great's soldiers who had settled in the East after his conquests. Whether fact or fiction linking Zenobia to both Macedonia and Cleopatra was as much about cultural symbolism as it was about bloodlines situating her firmly within the grand narrative of the Mediterranean world, where the greatest figures often embodied the crossroads of many civilizations. Little is known about Zenobia's childhood, but that silence allowed later generations to imagine extraordinary details. Stories claim she was raised more like a prince than a princess, that she rode horses from an early age, hunted alongside nomadic warriors in the desert, and learned to wield weapons while still a child. At the same time, she was tutored in languages and philosophy, a strange but compelling mix of desert hardness and Greek sophistication. Roman sources note that Zenobia could speak Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and even ancient Egyptian. For a woman in the 3rd century, such linguistic mastery was astonishing, marking her not only as a ruler but also as a genuine intellectual. It was said she devoured Homer and Plato, studied Eastern history, understood the Hebrew scriptures, and knew the legends of the Arabs. If true, Zenobia marched into battle not only with sword and spear, but also armed with a treasury of knowledge, a rare kind of weapon in an age when most women were confined to the household. Yet we must be cautious, for these portrayals may be part of a legend designed to craft a deliberate counter-image to Rome. An Eastern queen versed in Greek philosophy, fluent in the language of Rome and skilled in warfare, was precisely the kind of hybrid figure the Romans admired and despised at once. To them, Zenobia embodied something beyond their control, a challenge to their belief that Rome alone held the monopoly on civilization and power. Roman historians often betray this tension in their writings. They mocked her as arrogant, deceitful, a second Cleopatra with ambitions far beyond her reach. Yet they also could not deny her intelligence, eloquence, and charisma. Perhaps deep down, even those who tried to slander her were captivated, which explains why their accounts oscillate between ridicule and reluctant praise. In Syrian and Arab traditions, however, Zenobia was celebrated as a queen of the people, a protector against Rome's greed, a beacon of national pride. The image of Zenobia thus becomes a mosaic of perspectives. To Rome, she was a cunning rebel. To the East, she was a savior. But perhaps the truth lies in the fact that she was both. Only someone who was at once warrior and scholar, ruler and dreamer, could have risen to challenge the greatest empire of her age. Looking back at Zenobia's origins and youth, we see a story that resists clarity, a tangle of myth and record of invention and memory. Yet it is precisely this ambiguity that makes her such a powerful symbol. The harder a figure is to pin down, the more immortal they become in the imagination. Zenobia was not just flesh and blood, but a mirror reflecting the hopes and fears of her world. She was called Scholar Warrior, Queen Rebel Cleopatra's heir, Daughter of the Desert. Each label is true, and yet none captures her entirely. And perhaps that is what made her so dangerous in Rome's eyes. A warrior, Rome could crush a scholar. Rome could dismiss a woman. Rome could ignore. But a single person who embodied all three was something Rome was never prepared to face. Zenobia did not need to prove herself the descendant of Cleopatra, for she became a new Cleopatra on her own terms, one who wielded not only beauty, but also intellect and military might. From those shadowy origins, a new legend began to take shape, one destined to shake the foundations of Rome itself. Throughout history, there have been marriages arranged purely to secure power, and there have been marriages that became turning points for an entire city or even an empire. The union between Zenobia and Septimius Odaenathus belonged to the latter. Before Zenobia entered his life, Odaenathus was already a central figure in Palmyrene politics, a native leader who knew wind about Rome, yet carried enough pride to ensure his city would not fade into obscurity as just another provincial outpost of the empire. His military skill had earned him renown, especially after he repelled the invading Sassanid Persians in Mesopotamia, and Rome rewarded him with the lofty title Corrector Totius Orientis, the protector of the entire East. In a world where small birds were often crushed between the wings of eagles, Odaenathus had proved that Palmyra could stand tall as an independent power, at least within the desert and along the Silk Road. For Zenobia, becoming his wife was nothing short of destiny. No one knows exactly how their marriage began, but it is easier to imagine a political alliance than a romance of passion. Odaenathus needed a wife of lineage and intellect, someone who could strengthen his position in the eyes of both Rome and the people of Palmyra. Zenobia, with legends of Cleopatra's blood running through her veins with her Greek learning and desert boldness, was the perfect match. To the people she appeared not only as a queen adorned with gold and jewels, but as a scholar, a woman who could sit beside her husband discussing politics, someone who could hold her own at banquets and make Greek merchants or Roman officials listen. During their years together, Palmyra reached its golden age. Endless caravans of camels streamed in and out of the city, bringing such wealth that even Rome began to take notice. Odaenathus fortified the frontiers, drove back the Persians again and again, and even marched his army to Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital, an achievement that shook the entire East. In the shadow of those triumphs, Zenobia was always present. Some accounts claim she rode alongside him during military parades, even that she joined discussions of strategy. Whether or not she truly took part in battle is uncertain, but what is clear is that Zenobia carefully shaped the image of a queen who was not confined to the palace, a woman ready to share both the glory and the dangers of her husband's reign. But history has a taste for imperfection. The brilliance of Odaenathus and Zenobia did not last forever. In 267, at the very height of his power, Odaenathus was suddenly assassinated. It happened, they say, during a hunt, a pastime the Palmyrines regarded as a symbol of royal authority. A spear, a dagger, or perhaps a cunning plot, no one can be certain. What is certain is that Odaenathus fell without fanfare, and with him several of his close companions were cut down as well. Who was behind his death? That question has haunted history for centuries. Some Roman accounts suggest a family feud, perhaps a rebellious nephew or relative seizing power through murder. Others whisper of Persian hands at work, for who else had more to gain than Rome's eastern enemy when their strongest rival suddenly collapsed? But then comes another darker theory, one that is both bold and unsettling, that Zenobia herself, the very wife who once rode at Odaenathus' side, orchestrated the entire plot. This was not a baseless rumor. Roman writers repeated the accusation, often, for to them, Zenobia embodied the arrogance of the East, and a woman who dared step beyond her traditional role had to be stained with ambition and treachery. They compared her to Cleopatra, suggesting she had sacrificed her husband for the throne and for her son. No proof exists, of course, but we must remember history was written by Rome, and in their eyes, turning Zenobia into a scheming widow was the easiest way to dim her brilliance. Whatever the truth of Odaenathus' death, it left behind a massive power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped Zenobia. A widow, a young son, too small to rule, and a city surrounded by enemies on all sides. Such circumstances could easily have crushed Palmyra's fragile dynasty. But instead of retreating, Zenobia chose the opposite path. She became regent for her son Vaballathus, but in reality she quickly transformed herself into one of the most powerful figures of the ancient world, the only woman bold enough to place herself as an equal to the emperors of Rome. The death of Odaenathus did not just strip Palmyra of its most powerful leader, it also left behind a dangerous vacuum at the heart of the desert kingdom. His son Vaballathus was still only a child. By all logic, the throne should have been little more than a toy placed in the boy's hands, while the true fate of Palmyra was to be torn apart by generals and noble families eager for power. But history took a different turn. For behind that small, fragile throne stood Zenobia, at first merely a regent, yet soon she would transform that temporary role into the foundation of a rule unlike anything the East had seen before. Picture the scene: a young widow in the middle of a turbulent desert, surrounded by seasoned generals and watchful noble clans, all waiting for her to stumble so they might seize the throne. In such a setting, most would have expected Zenobia to retreat into the role of a gentle mother, keeping the seat warm until her son came of age. Instead, she stepped forward, and Palmyra became her kingdom. What set her apart was not just audacity, but the way she crafted her image, both as protector of her son and as the bearer of her city's destiny. From the very beginning, Zenobia proved she was no fragile flower. She rode out before the army donned armor and spoke like a commander. While many Roman noblewomen confined themselves to palace walls, Zenobia lived as though she were born a warrior. The Romans mocked her, saying she drank with soldiers and hunted with generals. Exaggerated or not, such tales reveal one truth. Zenobia had broken past every convention to assert herself as a queen in her own right. Yet power always casts a shadow. The mysterious death of Odaenathus has long raised a troubling question: did Zenobia have a hand in it? Some Roman sources whispered that she orchestrated the assassination, for she had every reason to do so. An ambitious, brilliant, and calculating woman, why should she remain in her husband's shadow when a single dagger in the night could raise her to the throne? But from Syria and the East came a very different story. There, Zenobia was painted not as a conspirator, but as the tragic victim of circumstance, forced to bear the weight of the crown after her husband's sudden death. To them, she was no murderer, but the savior of Palmyra, the one who held the kingdom together when assassins, perhaps rival nobles, perhaps Roman agents, sought to destroy Odaenathus' dynasty. The truth will never be known. That unanswered question hung over Zenobia like a ghost, a scandal that made her admired and doubted all at once. Yet it was precisely this ambiguity that forged her legend at once, a heroine carrying the burden of her son and her city, and a figure of Machiavellian cunning, long before Machiavelli himself, turning tragedy into opportunity and uncertainty into power. When Odaenathus was alive, Palmyra was still just a proud city-state, careful to keep itself under Rome's shadow. He was celebrated as the protector of the East, both ally and shield the wall that kept back the Persian storm. But after his sudden death, Zenobia wasted no time in tearing away that cloak of humility. From the position of a widowed queen, she transformed into a challenger to an empire. And in less than a decade, the map of the ancient world lit up with a new, dazzling yet dangerous color, the Palmyrene Empire. Her first move was as bold as it was reckless Egypt. The land of the Nile was not only Rome's breadbasket, it was also a symbol of power, once the throne of Cleopatra herself. For a woman as shrewd as Zenobia, Egypt was both a strategic prize and a symbolic conquest. Around 270, a Palmyrene army under General Zabdus marched into Alexandria and toppled Rome's governor. It was more than a military triumph, it was a proclamation. Palmyra was no longer Rome's watchman, it was seizing Rome's treasures for itself. The Romans used to far-off uprisings were genuinely shaken this time. But Zenobia did not stop. She sent her forces across the Arabian desert, punishing tribes that had harassed Palmyrene caravans, then pressed north into Anatolia. Step by step, the Palmyrene realm stretched from the Nile to Asia Minor, commanding the most vital trade routes of the ancient world. Seen from afar, Palmyra was starting to look like another Rome, but in the east. What set Zenobia apart was that she did not simply sit in her gilded palace waiting for news of victory. She rode alongside her retinue, appearing at campaigns, inspecting her troops, attending the triumphal rituals. To her soldiers, she was no distant figurehead. She was an Augusta in flesh and blood. In this, she crafted a contrast with Cleopatra, where Cleopatra had been famed for her beauty, her political cunning, and her ability to captivate powerful men. Zenobia offered a new vision. Cleopatra in armor, a queen who was not just enchanting in the palace, but who walked among her. Legions on the battlefield. Her choice of the title Augusta was a slap across Rome's face. It was a title reserved for Roman empresses, sharers of imperial glory, with the emperor himself, never for an Eastern widow and certainly not for a rival queen ruling over what Rome considered its provinces. Yet Zenobia, in breathtaking audacity, granted the imperial titles to herself and her son Vaballathus. Coins showed her crowned with the laurel wreath, draped in imperial robes, just like the portraits of Caesar or Augustus. Cleopatra had once longed to be recognized as Queen of Queens, but Zenobia declared she needed no recognition at all, for she already was queen. To Palmyra and the land she conquered, this image carried enormous weight. She was no longer just a regent for a boy, but a living emblem of independence, proof that the East could write its own story instead of living in Rome's shadow. In the streets of Egypt, whispers spread, had a new Cleopatra returned. Yet if Cleopatra had been remembered as a woman leaning on Roman lovers, Zenobia was a queen who made Rome itself tremble. Her campaigns were not merely driven by ambition, but by a clear strategic vision. Palmyra had always been a trading city, thriving by controlling the routes that linked the Mediterranean with Persia and India. But that wealth was fragile, vulnerable to Rome's will or Persia's might. Zenobia understood that only by turning Palmyra into a true empire, controlling the lifeblood of trade rather than depending on others, could she secure its future. Every conquest was a piece in her larger design. The vision of a queen who refused to stand beneath anyone. Yet it was this breathtaking expansion that placed Palmyra on a collision course with Rome. When Zenobia entered Alexandria, when she minted coins with her image crowned as Augusta, she was no longer a frontier ruler. She had made herself the equal of the Roman emperor, and that meant war was now only a matter of time. After expanding her territory through daring campaigns, Zenobia did not stop at being a mere conqueror. She understood that the strength of an empire was not only measured by victories on the battlefield, but also by how power was sustained, how the throne was legitimized, and how a ruler's image could inspire loyalty in her people while commanding respect from her enemies. In this, she showed remarkable wisdom, weaving together the cultural, political, and religious traditions of both East and West to craft a vision of sovereignty that Rome could not dismiss. The first thing to note is how Zenobia embraced the ceremonial grandeur of Eastern monarchies. She adorned herself in gold and purple, sat on a throne surrounded by the splendor of Palmyra's architecture, a city where Greek, Roman, and Persian styles blended into something that seemed almost mythical. The desert people were accustomed to rulers who bore a divine aura, and Zenobia knew they expected their queen to be not just a mother and protector, but also a goddess-like figure. She appeared in rituals with regal majesty, making it clear that she was not merely regent for her young son Vabilathus, but a queen in her own right, endowed with real power. Yet if she had stopped there, Zenobia might have been dismissed as nothing more than another Eastern monarch. What set her apart was her shrewd appropriation of Roman political style to craft a dual identity. She minted coins bearing both her likeness and that of Vabilathus, inscribed with the title Augusta, the Roman honorific reserved for empresses. This was not mere decoration, but a bold declaration. Zenobia was asserting that she was not just the sovereign of a desert city, but equal in stature to the rulers of the West. For a woman in Palmyra to claim the title Augusta was a direct challenge to Roman authority while also legitimizing her reign in the eyes of subjects long conditioned to revere Rome as the heart of the world. More than a symbol, Zenobia was deeply involved in governance. She crafted policies, issued laws, and played a decisive role in religious, financial, and diplomatic affairs. On one hand, she upheld the ancient rituals of Palmyra, honoring the god Bel, the sun, and the city's traditional cults, thus reassuring the native elite of her legitimacy. On the other hand, she maintained a Roman-style administration, employing educated officials and using Greek and Latin in state affairs, proving that Palmyra could function as efficiently as any Roman province, perhaps even more so. This fusion created something unique, a political model that evoked the opulence of the East while displaying the discipline and legal order of the West. To her people, Zenobia was not only a living goddess, but also a sharp-minded stateswoman. She mastered the balance between ceremony and substance, between sacred image and real authority. To her enemies, this was profoundly threatening. For an enemy with a sword was dangerous, but an enemy who could wield both sword and pen was nearly impossible to subdue. What most alarmed Rome, however, was not the rituals or the titles, but Zenobia's unmistakable ambition to build an independent Palmyrene empire that could stand as Rome's equal. She did not want Palmyra to remain a loyal vassal or a buffer state between Rome and Persia. She envisioned it as a new center of power, a true Eastern Rome. Egypt became key to this dream, for it was the granary of the empire feeding millions of Romans. By seizing Egypt, Zenobia effectively held Rome's throat in her hands. At the same time, she pushed into Anatolia, extending her reach to critical frontiers, redrawing the map so that Palmyra stretched from the Syrian desert to the Mediterranean coast. In the 3rd century, a time of chaos when Rome was torn apart by rapid successions of emperors, Zenobia may well have believed the moment had come to found a new empire. Many historians argue she sought to revive a Hellenistic civilization, reminiscent of Alexandria's Golden Age, but centered on Palmyra rather than Athens or Rome. This was no longer the aspiration of a desert city, but an imperial vision, a dream pursued only by those with unshakable faith in destiny. And yet history always raises its cruel question, could she ever have truly built an empire to rival Rome, or was it all a grand illusion, a defiant but impossible challenge against a colossus that, though weakened, still dominated the ancient world? Zenobia surely understood the risks of her path, but perhaps it was the power of legend itself that drove her forward. Like Cleopatra before her, she knew that history sometimes belongs only to those who dare to challenge the impossible. And she chose that path, the path of a desert queen who refused to kneel before Rome. In the blending of Eastern ceremony, Roman statecraft, and her own imperial ambitions, Zenobia fashioned an image of queenship that continues to inspire awe and unease. She was not merely the product of a wealthy desert city, but a woman who dared to defy the order of the world, planting in history the tantalizing question, could there ever have been an Eastern empire to stand beside Rome had Zenobia's gamble succeeded? At the very height of her power, when she sat upon the throne of Palmyra, ruling a vast dominion that stretched from the Nile to Anatolia, Zenobia seemed untouchable. Yet in Rome, history was quietly preparing to cast its most dangerous piece onto the board: Aurelian. If Zenobia embodied the daring and brilliance of the East, Aurelian was the incarnation of Rome's iron will and cold ruthlessness in its dying days. Aurelian had no noble blood in his veins. Born in humble circumstances, likely the son of an Illyrian farmer, he was shaped not by luxury, but by hardship. It was the soil of the Balkans, the long years spent in the ranks, that forged the man soldiers would call manu ad ferrum, the hand of steel. He was not an emperor born of senatorial intrigues, but a warrior crafted for a single purpose. Rome was fracturing, and only a sword that cut straight and without hesitation could stitch its wounds back together. When Aurelian ascended the throne in 270, the empire lay in three pieces. In the west, the Gallic Empire of Postumus and his heirs ruled Gaul and Britannia. In the east, Zenobia and Palmyra rose in defiance, their banners unfurled across conquered lands. At the center, what remained of Rome was weak, confused, and beset on every frontier. Aurelian's mission seemed nearly impossible: to be restitutor orbis, the restorer of the world. And fate decreed that to achieve this, he would have to break a woman who was building a world of her own. The Eastern campaign began not with swords, but with letters sharpened into threats. Aurelian knew better than to underestimate her. Zenobia was no mere regent who had drifted too far. She had crowned herself Augusta and styled her son Augustus, trampling on Rome's sacred titles. To the Senate, this was rebellion. To Aurelian, it was a personal insult. Zenobia, of course, did not tremble. She had seized Egypt, driven back Roman forces sent by Emperor Claudius II, and forced Syria and Arabia to bow before her. What were a few legions from the west to a woman who had already faced down empires? Her faith rested in the loyalty of Palmyra's army, in the fearsome desert cavalry that had once made Persia itself hesitate. But Aurelian was no Claudius, and he was no ordinary general. When he marched east, he brought not only elite legions, but also the patience and savagery of a predator. The first blows fell in Anatolia, where Zenobia's authority had taken root. One by one, cities and fortresses were tested. To her surprise, many yielded without resistance. Why? Because for the Greek and Roman communities of Asia Minor, Zenobia was still a foreign queen. Better to return to the familiar shadow of the Roman eagle than to trust the ambitions of an Eastern monarch. As he advanced, Aurelian spread a single message. He came not to slaughter, but to liberate cities from Palmyra's unlawful rule. His war was waged as much in mines as on battlefields, and it worked. Slowly, Zenobia's armies were cut off from their lifelines. Yet she did not falter. She rallied her forces, preparing for great battles. Her confidence remained unshaken, fed by the belief that Aurelian, like so many before him, would break upon the might of her desert horsemen and the unforgiving heat of Syria. What she did not realize was that Aurelian was one of the few men capable of turning a hostile landscape into an ally. Two figures, two destinies, two imperial dreams now hurtled toward collision. On one side stood a queen draped in the aura of Cleopatra, and Dido certain that power and allure could tilt the balance of history. On the other strode the warrior with hands of steel, a man who spared no one and nothing in his quest to restore what he called the glory of Rome. Inevitably, the road led them to the fields of blood at Antioch and Emesa, where the burning sun of the Middle East fell upon two vast armies. Zenobia, the desert queen, prepared to throw all of Palmyra's strength into the fight. Aurelian, the restorer of the world, readied himself to carve a new chapter for Rome. Only one would stand when the storm passed. There is a moment in history when you can almost feel the shift of destiny in your very skin. The moment when the brilliance of a dynasty, the dream of an empire, suddenly cracks under the unstoppable weight of its enemy. For Zenobia, that moment came as the Roman banners drew closer day by day, battle by battle, while each fragile hope turned to dust across the desert sands. Aurelian the emperor, hailed as restitutor orbis, the restorer of the world, was not a man easily defeated. He was not only a hardened warrior, but also a strategist who knew how to turn an enemy's strength into the very weapon that destroyed them. When Aurelian marched eastward, Palmyra was no longer facing a Rome that was rotting from within. This time Zenobia stood against a Rome reborn, a Rome determined to reclaim what had been lost, led by an emperor who would tolerate no rival throne. The first clash of these two great powers came at Antioch. Zenobia unleashed her famed cavalry, the same force that had once terrified Roman armies in the east, torn through Persian ranks and shaken the desert to its core. But Aurelian was too shrewd to be ensnared. He feigned retreat, drawing the Palmyrene horsemen into pursuit. Exhausted and cut off from their support, they were suddenly met with a brutal Roman counterattack. Defeated, Zenobia's forces fell back, leaving Antioch trembling in Rome's grasp. Next came Emesa, sacred city of the Severan dynasty and of the sun god Elagabal. Zenobia rallied her troops there, clinging to faith and loyalty, but Aurelian once again proved himself a master of war. The battle at Emesa turned into catastrophe for Palmyra. The heavy cavalry, Zenobia's pride, was scattered while her infantry crumbled before the Roman advance. As her desert warriors fell in droves to Roman steel, the dream of empire she had nurtured began to dissolve into smoke. After Emesa, there was nowhere left to stand but Palmyra itself, the jeweled city of the sands, her capital, where she hoped high walls and loyal citizens might withstand the storm. But history shows no mercy. Rome encircled the city. The silk roads once flowing with gold and silver were cut off. Supplies dwindled. Each passing day deepened the fear. Zenobia, who had once sat proudly on her throne and defied the world, now faced a cruel choice: die in despair or seek escape. She chose the Euphrates, that mighty river dividing Rome from Persia. If only she could cross it, if only she could reach King Shapur, perhaps she might rekindle her power, rebuild her realm. Legends tell of Zenobia boarding a boat still draped in royal robes, still carrying her innate pride, her gaze fixed toward the Persian horizon as if destiny still answered to her. But Aurelian was faster. The Romans caught her midstream. The boat was stopped. And there, in her final act of desperation, Zenobia was taken alive, not slain as a warrior queen, but dragged down into the hands of her enemies. That image, a queen who once shook Rome itself, now trembling as a captive, was among the most tragic spectacles of the 3rd century. The Palmyrene Empire, her creation from ashes, which in only a few short years had stood alongside Rome and Persia, collapsed in an instant. Her people, once devoted to her, now faced the harsh truth: their desert queen could protect them no longer. Zenobia's defeat was not merely the fall of a woman, but the fall of a vision. The dream that the world might hold more than just Rome and Persia, that even amid barren sands, an empire might rise to rival the greatest of antiquity. But history has no patience for dreams that burn too brightly. Some say that had Zenobia been born in another age, she might have triumphed. But the 3rd century gave her no such chance. Palmyra, for all its splendor, was too young, too fragile. And Rome, under Aurelian's command, once again proved why it endured for centuries, weathering crisis after crisis. Zenobia was captured, marched off to Rome, and with her, another tragic chapter began. Yet at the Euphrates, where she fell, history had already written its ending, the final stroke of one of the greatest challenges Rome had ever faced. When we look back at Zenobia's final appearance on the stage of history, the image most people conjure is that of a desert queen dragged in chains, paraded before the curious and mocking eyes of tens of thousands of Romans. It is the classic scene in the Western imagination: Zenobia as the woman who dared to defy Rome, only to meet the fate that awaited all who challenged the empire, being crushed beneath its colossal machinery. And yet the truth of her ending is far murkier, and it is precisely that ambiguity that has allowed Zenobia to live on, suspended between tragedy and legend. According to Roman historians, after being captured while fleeing toward Persia, Zenobia was brought to Rome. The year was 274 when Emperor Aurelian staged the greatest triumph of his career. Sources claim that Zenobia was forced to walk at the head of the procession, weighed down by heavy chains of jewels, so burdensome she nearly collapsed, while the crowd erupted in applause at the downfall of the woman who had once styled herself Augusta. The scene was both cruel and symbolic. Rome demonstrating to the world that even a second Cleopatra, even the queen of the desert, could end her story only as a humiliated captive. And yet there is a strange paradox in the ancient accounts. Aurelian, it seems, did not deal with her as harshly as many expected. Some sources say that after the triumph, Zenobia was not executed, but instead granted a villa at Tivoli near Rome where she lived out her days in relative luxury and honor. Legends even whisper that she remarried a Roman senator, raised her children within Roman culture, and died peacefully. It was a curious fate for someone who had once threatened the very survival of the empire. Other accounts, however, paint a darker picture. They suggest Aurelian showed no such mercy that Zenobia perished in prison, whether from illness, poison, or simple elimination, to prevent her from becoming a rallying symbol for rebellion. History gives us no definitive answer, and in that silence, 1,000 legends were born. What is certain is that the image of Zenobia escaped Rome's grasp. Even in defeat, she was remembered not merely as a rebel, but as a queen of extraordinary stature. Roman historians, who were rarely kind to Rome's enemies, spoke of her with unusual respect. They described her as intelligent, courageous, educated, fluent in multiple languages, and the equal of the greatest kings. Such praise was almost never afforded to women, let alone to one who dared to defy Rome. Zenobia's legacy is a complicated one. For Palmyra, she embodied the dream of independence, the vision of a small desert city-state, daring to stand shoulder to shoulder with the superpowers of the age Rome and Persia. That dream collapsed swiftly, but it proved that the desert could do more than bow its head. For the Arab world, she became a symbol of the East's hidden strength against the relentless pressure of the West. And in the eyes of later Europeans, she was romanticized as a new Cleopatra, less defined by seduction, more by political pride and unyielding ambition. Art, literature, and even opera drew inspiration from her. During the Renaissance, Zenobia appeared in paintings and sculptures as a proud heroine. In European drama, she became the figure of tragedy, a radiant queen brought low by fate. Even in modern times, whenever history remembers the women who stood out against the odds, Zenobia's name surfaces as proof that power was never the sole domain of men. There is one final paradox. Zenobia's failure made her more famous than any victory could have. Had she won and founded a lasting Palmyrene empire, perhaps today we would remember her merely as one ruler among many. But it was precisely because of her defeat, its grandeur, its tragedy, that she transcended the role of monarch to become a symbol. She is remembered not just for having ruled, but for daring to dream a dream too vast, for stepping out of Rome's shadow to light a star of her own in the desert. Zenobia's story closes in a haze of uncertainty and myth. We do not know how she died, but we know how she lived, proud, intelligent, daring, and ambitious. That is her immortal legacy. A flame burning in the darkness of empire, a reminder that even when Rome stood at the center of the world, there were women, there were outsiders bold enough to rise and declare, "We too can be an empire."